Great, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar on advancing reconciliation and growing the Indigenous economy, a role for investors. My name is Shannon Rohan, and I'm the Director of Responsible Investment Leadership at Share. I am a settler of Irish and Polish descent, and I'm very grateful to live, work, and play on lands that were never ceded and lands that make up the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. At Share, we are committed to reconciliation and to being effective allies with Indigenous communities and supporting reconciliation efforts in our networks and in the industry in which we work, and that's really the investment industry. So before going any further, I would like to turn it over to Sarah Lyons, who is the Vice President at the Community Foundations of Canada, as well as the co-chair of the Circle on Philanthropy, to say a few words.
Thanks, Shannon. Hi, it's Sarah. As Shannon said, I work both for community foundations, and I also have the honor of being the co-chair along with Tim Fox of the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal People in Canada. And both organizations are very excited to be one of the presenting partners or kind of partners on Foundation Investing 2.0. Just a little bit of background. I think many on the call will be familiar with Community Foundations of Canada, the Pan-Canadian network of community foundations. The Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples, or the Circle, is a small organization that's been around for about 10 years that transforms philanthropy and contributes to positive change with Indigenous communities by creating shared spaces of learning, innovation, relationship building, co-creation, and activation. And on behalf of both organizations, we're really excited about this particular webinar for a myriad of reasons, but in particular because as infrastructure and leadership organizations in philanthropy, we understand that this is a key moment for the use of endowed assets in positive ways, be those through market investments or direct investments, but also that in the spirit of building Indigenous economies, as well as reimagining how wealth is generated and how wealth is distributed, this particular focus of this webinar is critical. So just want to offer a thank you to all the other partners for everything that's led us to this webinar today and everything afterwards, and just underline how thrilled both organizations are to be both partners in the initiative, but also at the great interest and what will come after the webinar in today's topic. Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you, Sarah. That's great. And thank you for your ongoing support and the support from the Circle and also from the Community Foundations of Canada. So quickly, I just want to go through some housekeeping issues. Everyone on the webinar will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. We have reserved the last 10 minutes to take questions from the audience, but due to the large number of participants, we ask that you submit your questions through the chat box function located in the webinar panel on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. We encourage everyone to send questions in throughout the presentation, so don't wait until the end. Please just send them through as they come up for you, and we can make sure that we get those questions in the queue. If your question is directed to a specific speaker, that would be great if you could also indicate that. And if for some reason we don't get to all of the questions on the call, we will follow up by email after the webinar. The webinar is being recorded and will be provided by email to everyone who has registered, and will also be made available on the Foundation Investing 2.0 website. So I just wanted to also give a bit of background to folks about the Foundation Investing 2.0 initiative. This is an initiative of the Canadian Environmental Grantmakers Network, Community Foundations of Canada, Philanthropic Foundations of Canada, and the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada. It is being implemented by Share and Rally Assets, and we're really excited. It's been amazing to work with all of the partners so far, and we're really coming together and committed to helping foundations implement more and better impact and responsible investing strategies across their endowment portfolios. And the work that we're bringing together is really designed for foundation trustees, CEOs, executive directors, and senior finance staff to support them wherever they might be in their journey with regards to looking at their endowment and the way that's being invested. So we invite you to keep in touch and watch for the various events and tools and resources that we'll be delivering throughout this year. And then briefly, just to give you a bit of background about Share, for those of you who may not be familiar, we are a nonprofit organization committed to mobilizing investor leadership to build a more sustainable and inclusive economy. We work with a network of over 100 organizations, including foundations, religious investors, universities, pension funds, and asset managers collectively who hold over 22 billion in assets. And we really focus our efforts in trying to drive demonstrable changes in corporate practices through shareholder engagement and proxy voting. So I do want to pass it over to Andrea Nempton from Rally Assets so that she can talk a bit and give you some background about Rally and also move us through the next few slides. So over to you, Andrea.
Great, thank you, Shannon, and hello, everybody. I'm really grateful to be part of this amazing group of people that are working to try and deliver a little bit of content to have us all, as Shannon said, be a bit more conscious of how our assets are invested and the kind of impact that those are having. I'm grateful to be speaking to you from the city of Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. And I say that to acknowledge my gratitude for being able to be here, to those caretakers of this land. It's covered with the Dish with One Spoon territory treaty. And so I'm really pleased today. We have a group of really knowledgeable panelists who are going to share one of the things that we're doing a lot with this Foundation 2.0 sort of series of educational webinars, panels, master classes, tools, and content, really trying to focus a lot on peer-to-peer learning. And with impact investing, that's some of the most valuable opportunities to be able to learn how others have gone on their journey of impact investing and how they address different challenges. Every investor has a different set of goals, a different set of restrictions, a different set of needs that they need their assets or their endowments to be able to achieve. A little bit about me. I'm the executive director at Rally Assets. And Rally is a full-service impact investing advisory firm. We came from the Purpose Capital, transition from Purpose Capital, where we've always been very committed to field building, education, and research, and specifically in the area of impact investing. And previous to that, I know many of you from my work at Inspirit. So pleased to be here today, and it's my honor to be able to introduce you to our panelists. So we'll be speaking with Brodie Guy, who is the Executive Director of Coast Funds. Erica Barbosa Vargas is going to be joining us from McConnell Foundation and talking a little bit about their work. And Jeffrey Sear, Managing Partner of Indigenous Capital Partners, will be talking a little bit about the Raven Indigenous Capital Fund. So we're going to start off really with advancing, I'm going to hand it back over to Shannon to talk a little bit about advancing reconciliation. We'll be going through some key steps and some of the learning that Share has had, and really many of us have had in our entrance to this this journey. But first, I'm going to talk a little. So we're talking a little bit about the context within which we are doing this investment activities, and then so for me personally, this journey to impact investing to address reconciliation began at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. For many of us, it began there, but for many more, it began far before that. Really, the Truth and Reconciliation was a moment in time in the history of colonization in Canada. And it was a moment in time that was created from the single largest class action suit in the history of our country that was put forward against the faith communities and the government of Canada for the residential school system that created so much damage to so many Indigenous peoples in this country, in this land. And so at the end of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was mandated by the settlement of that class action suit, and so really actually paid for by the survivors of residential schools taken out of their settlement, came forward a series of actions, calls to action, and there was 94 in total. And one of them really specifically spoke to the issues of economic reconciliation. And so I'm going to just read it out here. The call to action 92, speaking directly to the corporate sector, which many of us are invested in. The corporate sector and their leadership should adopt the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples. This is quite a powerful, the UNDRIP, this is called, is one that actually, some of the very key elements of it is the need for free, prior, and informed consent. And this one speaks directly to many of our resource companies, which it really mandates them to be able to have to work in collaboration and partnership with the original and current holders of that land. And so committing to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and attaining free, prior, and informed consent in terms of economic development projects. This is really important to us as investors because we want to ensure that we are invested in companies that are actually behaving in accordance with these guidelines. The next one on the call to action 92 is ensuring that Indigenous peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector. Again, this is an important piece for us as shareholders and corporations throughout our country to make sure that the companies that we are investing in are actually working to be able to fulfill this goal through their training and CSR activities. And the third is that the corporate sector must provide education for management staff in the history of Indigenous peoples. This is the last one, is really crucial to us being able to progress in terms of reconciliation within our country. I'll go to the next slide, and one of the things that we did at In Spirit and with many others, a group of people, was actually created the Declaration of Action, which called the philanthropic community to uphold the calls to action that were presented in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the first step within that declaration was to learn and remember. And so that's why that third piece, the third call to action in 92 is so crucial. So I know that many people on the line, many of the organizations on the line are from the philanthropic community, and probably many of them have actually signed this Declaration of Action. And what it does is it really encourages every philanthropic organization to take a role in advancing reconciliation in this country as much in any way that they possibly can, through their granting, through their actions, through their engagements, and through their investing activities. So it's really nice for us to see so many people signing up for this webinar today and being on the call. I'm going to now go to the next slide, which is actually to show us a little bit about what our agenda is for today. Oh, sorry, excuse me. I apologize for that. One of the things, just go back to the last one. One of the things that's happened in this country because of the history of colonization, because of the damage to residential schools, because of the imbalanced relationship between settlers and the Indigenous peoples of this land, is that there's been an incredible amount of pent-up potential within the Indigenous communities. There's been, we've sort of missed out on a huge amount of productivity, employment, affluence, and actually prosperity in our country. And these are things that we can actually directly address through our investing activities. There's been identified, you can see on this slide that there's actually the potential for 8.5 billion in income to be increased annually. Through investment in the Indigenous communities, there's the potential to increase employment by 6.9 billion, the potential for 100,000 jobs in this country. 8.4 billion people that can be supported in terms of living in poverty, and the potential to close the economic gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada would boost our GDP. And I sort of always have a little bit of a tough time with these statistics because, you know, this is, I just want to put it in context that, you know, we need to be strong participants in reconciliation, not for our country's GDP boost, but so that we can actually have a livable country for everyone. And so there's obviously an incredible amount of potential for us to be able to move towards that by actually meaningfully and mindfully looking at where our dollars go, and so much potential. So we'll move to the next slide. So that was a little bit of an introduction and background and in terms of what has brought us here to be looking at how we can actually align our assets with these values of moving towards reconciliation in Canada. And now I'm going to hand it over to Shannon to talk about some of the key steps that we can take.
Great, thank you, Andrea. Just briefly, I wanted to let folks know about the Reconciliation and Responsible Investment Initiative, which is a joint initiative and share in the National Aboriginal Trust Officers Association. This has been an extraordinary journey for SHARE and a great partnership with NATOA. And the work is really driven from a shared belief that investors have an important role to play in advancing reconciliation. And so we're working together to demonstrate to investors ways that they can align their capital with the principles of a reconciliation and also help them to amplify their voices in support of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Call to Action 92. A key aspect of that work is not only working with non-Indigenous investors, but also with Indigenous trustees across Canada and supporting their efforts to align their trust investments with community values, with community development aspirations, and the broader goals of economic reconciliation for both current and future generations. Recently, many of you may have seen that we published a guide called Advancing Reconciliation, a guide for investors. The purpose of the guide was really to provide tangible steps and case studies about ways in which investors can practice reconciliation within their organizations and how the calls to action from the TRC can be reflected in their investment policies and practices. So you'll see here on the screen, we've sort of laid out 5 steps. And I don't want to go into these in detail just because of time, but I really encourage you to take a look at the guide. And really the 2 that relate to the investment piece particularly are the embedding in the investment framework and investing in the Indigenous economy. The first 3 are, I'm not skipping them because they're not important. They are really, really important. I encourage you to look at all of these, but maybe just to provide a few tangible steps here around ways that you can embed reconciliation in your investment framework. And I think that really starts with looking at, you know, that sort of overarching governance piece and your investment policies. We've been working with funds that have been incorporating, for example, reference to the UN Declaration into their investment policies, and also looking at their support to invest in Indigenous businesses and economic reconciliation. And that really provides the basis to have meaningful conversations, I think, with your service providers and your investment managers in terms of what they're doing to incorporate Indigenous rights and other considerations into the way that they're making investment decisions. We'll hear from Brodie in a few minutes about the proxy voting piece and how investors and foundations are using the rights associated with their proxies to make sure that they're voting in favor of issues that are coming up on company ballots related to Indigenous rights and reconciliation. And finally, we're working with a broad group of foundations as well as Share's broader network of investors to be driving change in Canadian companies, not only in terms of Indigenous rights and sort of with resource companies, but also looking across the economy at ways that companies can increase their procurement, for example, from Indigenous owned business, include Indigenous heritage as a criterion in board diversity. We know that less than 1% of board seats are held by Indigenous people, and so there's a lot that Canadian companies can be doing, and we're really excited to be pushing that agenda on behalf of a broad group of investors. The second piece, investing in the Indigenous economy, there are a number of different opportunities here. Again, I will ask you to review the guide. There are some opportunities in, with existing Indigenous financial institutions. The First Nations Finance Authority bond is an opportunity in the fixed income space, and we also are looking at the Indigenous Growth Fund from the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. So these are opportunities that are emerging, and we'll hear later from Raven Indigenous Capital, which is really leading in the venture capital space. So I do just want to move on and actually get to our speakers, who are really, the ones that are leading and providing us with examples in this space. So I'd like to introduce Brodie from Coast Funds, who is the Executive Director of Coast Funds, and we're just going to switch over the screen here, and I know Brodie has a few slides that he's going to take us through. So I'm really excited that Brodie, you can be here today with us. It's been wonderful working with Coast Funds, and maybe to start off with, Brodie, you can tell us just a little bit of background about Coast Funds, what's special about it, and what's the problem you're trying to address?
Thanks, Jen, real pleasure to join you today, and I hope that the next few minutes are something of value to everyone joining us. Looking forward to sharing a bit about our journey in terms of socially responsible investment. So Coast Funds is, and I've got a few visuals to help us here. So the first thing I'd want to say is, we work in service of and for First Nations across what's known today as the Great Bear Rainforest and Haida Gwaii regions of the west coast of Canada. And, these nations, just like every other Indigenous nation across Canada, is cared for and dependent on their unceded territories forever. And it only recently has that long-term stewardship been disrupted by colonization and settlements. Now, the First Nations that we work for, there's 27 different First Nations, and Coast Funds is structured much like, I like to explain it to people, it's like a community foundation that each nation has in the endowment at Coast Funds. And so that's important when we think about how the fund is structured in terms of its Indigenous leadership, which it is community-led, and I'll speak briefly about our board structure as well. So when we look at this slide, we're looking at nations that are ranging from 23 people following a small family-based hereditary structure in the Quaker First Nation to the Haida Nation of many thousand people. And this is the region that we're looking at. You can see down in the bottom corner, there's Vancouver, and in the top would be Alaska. So most of the coast of British Columbia. The pins on the map show the locations of First Nations as they are today, but you'll notice that some are located in Vancouver Island, and that's because of forced removal from their territories by the Indian agents and the Government of Canada during the last even just 100 years. So when we move on to Coast Funds, and it was created just over 10 years ago to make the vital connection between strengthening First Nations well-being and stewardship efforts. And our mandate is one that is to be in perpetuity. The nations worked with the government, forestry industry, and private philanthropy to raise $120 million, and at the same time change legislation across the area that's now known as Great Bear Rainforest through strategic land use planning agreements and also reconciliation protocols with the Crown. And in doing so, they were able to change the law and protect the vast regions of their territories from exploitation and extraction, but at the same time raise money towards moving their communities towards a more sustainable conservation-based economy. And that's the goal that Coast Funds has in working in service of them. Speaking briefly around this topic, our goal at Coast Funds is to support these nations around sustainable stewardship finance. Now it's representing about a quarter of the world's remaining coastal temperate rainforests, and our work is really around fulfilling ancestral rights and responsibilities and reclaiming identity, language, culture, and nationhood. And we do this work to support these nations as they restore their authority and self-government capacity in today's modern context. And the financing that we'll talk about, the endowment, is generating money to build a new public service. And many might be familiar with the term Guardian Watchman. That is something that was born in this region by the Haida Nation and is being replicated across the country. So the funds that we're working on are, in a sense, working as a treasury to finance this new self-government capacity in their public service around stewardship, guardian, watchman, resource management, and towards ultimately securing title over their unceded territories in this region. So that brings me, that's a bit of context, Shannon. I don't know if you had any other question or if you'd like me to move into the ESG part.
Yeah, we'd love to hear about your efforts in terms of the investment side. Thanks, Brodie. That's great context.
Okay, thank you. So looking at this, we've got ESG plus, and I think it's just because ESG, environmental social governance, typically, from our research and looking around, Indigenous issues have really been bucketed just under the social element, and we really don't see it that way. Certainly the communities we're working for and our board see it as the top, most highest order of value that we need to think about in terms of our investments. We don't want to be investing in what we were just talking about in terms of self-government capacity and restoring inherent stewardship responsibilities across this region at the expense of other global Indigenous peoples, let alone Indigenous peoples in other parts of Canada. So it's really important that we think about the relatively small asset base that we have in ensuring that we have reliable finance for the nations we're serving, but that we're earning it in a way that doesn't contradict the mandate of our fund. The leadership comes from these people that represent our board. We have Percy Crosby, Barbara Wilson, Megan Moody, and Christina Gray, all representing various parts of the coast. And they're joined with allies that are former deputy ministers, venture capitalists, conservationists, and investment experts. They're working with an asset base of $55.8 million. 10 years ago, it would have been majority equities with some bonds, and you can see that today it's a diversified asset base and it is financing a permanent base of stewardship jobs. So it really needs to return a reliable investment to the communities so that they have sustainable jobs in terms of guardian, watchman, and stewardship in their territories. And I'll talk briefly just about how these different asset classes are invested responsibly. So firstly, the first thing that the board did 10 years ago was look at divestment. What areas are just too harmful in terms of the work that we're trying to see change in the world? Where do we not want to be? And so we have no tar sands, specifically no Enbridge at all, given the Northern Gateway pipeline and its effect and lack of understanding of Indigenous values in the region we work in, and including a number of other sort of standard areas that you would see being divestment areas. And so that's a starting point for us 10 years ago, and I think a lot of people would look at it that way. But we wanted to go further through time so that we're not just not placing our money into these harmful areas, but we're also looking at things more robustly. And so that led us, as we started diversifying our asset base, to look at an Indigenous-led investment strategy where we could further the Indigenous economy, much like the the opening comments by both yourself, Shannon, and Andrea were referring to. So one of the assets that we own is this Cape Scott Wind Farm that's co-owned by 3 First Nations located on North Vancouver Island, not too far from the community of Port Hardy. And it's powering the electrical grid on Vancouver Island with renewable energy, and at the same time generating benefits for the local First Nations in terms of employment and revenue. And most importantly, this project was led with and co-designed with First Nations. And so that's a type of asset that makes sense for us to be holding and generating money for stewardship from this type of investment. When we look at that in terms of that type of an investment, we would call that a positive screen as far as our investments in infrastructure, where we have good partners and good fund managers to help us locate those types of projects. And so we have First Nations-owned renewable energy projects in wind, hydro, and solar. And we're also a holder of bonds through the First Nations Finance Authority in terms of our fixed income part of the portfolio that supports clean water projects on reserves, housing, and renewable energy projects. And in addition, we actually have infrastructure investments in elder care facilities. So that would be the positive screening part. Now, this part's about the shareholder engagement, and that Shannon, you had alluded to the proxy voting work, and that's something that's more recent. In May 2019, just a little over a month ago, we released our investment guidelines, which we haven't formally announced, but we'll be doing that in the near future. But it gives direction to our fund managers, specifically equity fund managers, where we own stocks in various companies that we're not interested in divesting in. We want to actually help to encourage them to be better, better actors in their corporate governance, and certainly in their work recognizing Indigenous values. And so the first one that you can see is we're actually advocating for companies to be obtaining free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. And that comes from our belief that really to secure project access and for companies to ensure that their invested assets really realize a return for their shareholders, they really have to recognize the right of Indigenous peoples to their free, prior, and informed consent, and deliver tangible benefits for the communities that they're operating with. And so, in our view, companies really have to recognize and follow the UN Declaration of Rights on Indigenous Peoples, so those are our values. And so we work with Share and with our fund manager and with our independent investment advisor to put this new set of investment guidelines together. And it's really an interesting project of taking something from dreaming up the idea and thinking about our collective values at the board, and then putting it into practice and starting to change behaviors by fund managers, and ultimately with the corporate sector in Canada, and also with the global equities we hold. So that's really the key focus here, but we did also add, proxy voting around human rights and workers' rights. We're focusing our shareholding voting on international standards for sustainability. We've looked at a number of international standards, and we're looking to vote towards moving companies in the right direction around many of these things that are emerging movements that are starting to have traction, and we want to be a part of that. Our values and shareholder responsibility also extends to mitigating climate change, and we have very specific examples around how we want to vote for companies to recognize that and incorporate that into their operations. And then lastly, disclosure of their environmental, social, and governance responsibilities. There's been some really good work done internationally with the Global Reporting Initiative guidelines, and we've looked at that, and we've said that's something that we want to see all of the companies adopt in their proxy and annual report disclosures. And so we're voting for that as well through our holdings. And so just sort of in closing, want to recognize the partners that we work with, Share guiding us through this process to develop these new investment guidelines, but George and Bella gives us an independent investment advice, and then you see the 4 fund managers that we work with to realize our values through our investments. And so, closing, hopefully that gives some ideas to some people joining us on this call. I really welcome conversations with people, because we're trying to do something that makes sense for coast funds and the First Nations we're working for. But really, at the end of the day, if we can put this out as a public good in Canada, and hopefully even further around how, philanthropy and foundations and individuals can look at, divesting, shifting their holdings to invest in Indigenous peoples and really driving change in corporate governance. That'd be just wonderful to try to contribute to that movement that, many on this call are part of. And so welcome any further conversations if people are interested in the kinds of things we touched on here on the call. Thank you, Shannon.
Thanks so much, Brodie. I know that's a lot of incredible activity and lots of narrative sort of packed into 10 minutes. So thank you for doing that. And we're going to switch now to talk to back to Andrea, who's going to introduce Erica from McConnell.
Hi. Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Brodie. That was fantastic. What amazing work you're doing. I think the Great Bear Rainforest is one of the triumphs of so many of our change makers in Canada. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Erica Barbosa, who is the Director of Solutions Finance at the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation. Erica, and there she leads strategies for financial innovation and for integrating the Foundation's financial assets to support social and economic systems transformation. Her team oversees the management of the impact investing portfolio and ESG integration within the Foundation's larger endowment. And she completed undergraduate studies in behavior psychology and neuroscience and holds an MBA in public economic policy from the LSE and political science, London School of Economics and Political Science. So she's got the right background to be able to do this innovative approach to investment financing and change making. Eric and I have been around many tables for a number of years together, working to move impact investing strategies forward in Canada. And today she's going to talk to us a little bit about how, through her leadership and the work of her team, she's been investing, incorporating impact investing into their programming, and specifically where it intersects with reconciliation. And I'll hand it over to you, Erica.
Great, thank you, Andrea. Do I have control over the slides? Yeah. Excellent, thank you very much.
Erica, if you could just tell me when to switch through the slides, sorry. Thanks.
Sure, we can go to the first one. Great. I thought I'd give a little bit of background of the foundation, and then some information on our approach to our reconciliation work, and then I'll end with a couple of examples of projects related to impact investing for the foundation. But McConnell was established in 1937. It's the second oldest private family foundation in Canada. And its philanthropic practice has evolved over the years. It started local in the Montreal area, then became national. Last year, we had an endowment of $650 million, and we give about 4% of that amount every year in grants. One of the transitions in its philanthropic practice that has happened over the last 20 years also is it's moved to incorporate this notion of social innovation across all the different domains in which it operates. And underlying that concept is the idea that we want to try to get at the root cause of the issues that we're trying to address. And within that umbrella concept, we started to focus a lot of our activities and efforts into developing social finance as a tool. And at the beginning, so I joined the foundation in 2011 to help ramp up some of the activity in that space. The foundation had already started to explore what does it mean to mobilize some of its endowment assets for social impact in addition to its grants. But the notion was still very much seeing impact investing as an opportunity to bring private capital into community sector activities and strategies. Most of the strategies were still built from the perspective of just the community sector and our grant making. I think where we are now, after having built a portfolio of 25 impact investments over the last 10 years, is we've really moved from just scaling initiatives on our granting side being complemented with impact investments to really approaching issues with a systems lens. So we now, for the last few years, have been operating more from a mentality of, we have given all the assets that we have as a foundation, from grants to concessionary investments to our endowments, and understanding how to mobilize all of those. We have an opportunity to say, what are the systemic issues that we're trying to address? Therefore, what are the right types of partnerships that we need in order to support that transformation? And at the service of that type of work, what are the types of capital resources that we need to mobilize? So do we bring in grants, do we bring in investments, or do we bring a combination of all of those? And we're moving further into that direction. So the last few years, we rebranded my department's work that was initially social finance to be called solutions finance, really to be encompassing of the entire spectrum of capital that can be provided for systems change, from grants to impact investments to what was being discussed earlier around just shareholder engagement and other activities that we have at our disposal as investors. So on the next slide, I thought I would briefly touch on the McConnell's reconciliation journey. So established in 1937, the foundation in 2003 was the first grant made to an Indigenous organization, the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, led by Cindy Blackstock. So this is the national organization developed in 1998 that really provides research, policy, professional development, and networking to support First Nations child and family service agencies across the country. 2008, we had the creation of the Circle in Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada, so also a very important milestone in our field. In 2012, our board decided to make reconciliation a priority and launched the McConnell Reconciliation Initiative, and that was really a pivotal point for our foundation and the work here, and currently being led by a fantastic team led by my colleague Nicole McDonald, which many of you may know. And so the journey continues more on the granting side. 2015, a number of partners, including the National Association of Friendship Centers, the Circle, 4R's Youth Movement, and Canadians for a New Partnership, hosted an Indigenous Innovation Summit in Winnipeg. And one of the key takeaways from that summit was that Indigenous innovators had a difficult time accessing capital to test, implement, and grow their ideas. And Jeff will be able to talk to you about this in a little bit more detail in his presentation. 2016, McConnell supported the launch of the Indigenous Innovation Demonstration Fund, which partly stemmed out of the summit, and the idea was to surface what types of innovations would come out of the various communities. And we received a significant number, over 60, really 70 applications from across the country for projects from everything from child welfare, housing, food security, business development, IT, etc. And building on the success of that platform, then in partnership with Grand Challenges Canada, the Indigenous Innovation Initiative was launched to be able to create a platform where innovations could be surfaced and financed to be tested and then taken to scale. We're fortunate to have partnered also and supported in modest capacity Raven at its early stages for some support to Indigenous entrepreneurs and to help set up the fund that Jeff will talk to you about. And our first investment in this space was in 2014 through a partnership with SOCA and the Aboriginal Savings Capital Corporation based in out of Quebec City at the Huron-Wendat nation. But before I get to that example, Sharon, if we can come back to the previous, yeah, exactly, thank you. So McConnell has, over the time, been testing with a whole different types of approaches in this space. One of the challenges, but also the opportunities, is that the breadth and the scale of the different issues facing Indigenous communities are very, very varied. You have everything from housing, education, healthcare, child welfare. All these issues are interconnected, and so one of the things that we've learned that has made it extremely difficult to focus on any one area. And more importantly, I think that part of the approach and what defines how it is that we engage in these communities right now is really by asking communities where they would like to focus their efforts, and us as an organization to bring the resources that we have at hand to support that, as opposed to taking a top-down approach where we decide what is the one issue that we want to focus and then put all of our efforts into that effort. And so right now, what really defines our strategy is the focus to transition to a reconciliation economy, which essentially means a state in which wealth and resources are equitably shared and sustainably managed. And by wealth, we mean everything material wealth as well as health, belonging, community well-being. Resources are both natural but also human, so people and knowledge. Equitably acknowledges Indigenous rights and treaty obligations, and sustainably, my colleagues would say that's at a minimum what we want. We should also be looking at regenerative economy, so giving back more than what we're taking. And so, yes.
Oh, go ahead. I'll just let you finish that thought. And I think that from the breadth of what you've described and the history and the approach that McConnell's taken, which is so multifaceted, I think you set the most amazing context. We were hoping to be able to have the time for you to take us through some of your initiatives, and I think that we're just starting to run out of time in terms of the webinar, because we want to leave a little bit of time for Jeff. And so I'd like to suggest to the webinar participants that we will be able to share the deck afterwards, and I'll give you just a minute to sort of wrap this up, Erica, and I think that the next portion was you to talk through the sort of 3 examples. But we're going to have to gloss over that. We'll have Jeff speak a little bit about Raven, and then we'll be able to open it up a little bit for questions, because we just want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for questions at the end. Is that okay?
Perfect.
Okay, awesome.
Maybe the only so did you want to go with Jeff, or you want me to talk about one of the examples?
Why don't you wrap it up and give us sort of a last sort of your closing thoughts, and we'll just move it over to Jeff to start talking about some of the initiatives, because I know that Raven Capital is one of the ones that you were going to profile.
Sure. I think essentially what I'll say is that just looking at it from as a philanthropic organization and as an investor, I would say that we do have an opportunity to actually deploy the whole set of capital. The example of AppScan, we provided some grants to support the capacity building of communities, and then provided some loan capital that enabled to leverage financial institutions' capital to provide more mortgage lending on reserve, which is not something that happens, that is a widespread practice. Jeff will tell you a little bit more about Raven and the work that they're doing there. And we are also looking at the moment to activate more our shareholder engagement, not only around free, prior, informed consent, but there's a whole range of issues that as investors we can push on, for example, on diversity more broadly, on every company and employment practices, from financial institutions to others across the country. So the opportunities are widespread, and I'll leave it there, and then we can take any questions if there's any time.
Thanks, Erica. And I'm sorry, I think that next webinar we should definitely make sure that we have an hour and a half, because there's, McConnell's journey has been so long and so so thoughtful and so innovative that I think that we could all, I know I probably speak for everyone on the call, that I could listen to you for about another 20 minutes. And so, however, I'd like to now take a moment to introduce Jeff Sears, who's going to be speaking to us about Raven Indigenous Capital Partners. And Jeff I met Jeff when he was still working at National Association of Friendship Centers. He was the executive director there. That's Canada's largest Indigenous service provision organization, managing multi-million-dollar portfolios and programs across the country. He's had a number, again, a very sort of varied and really incredible background that ranges from the private, public, and governmental sector. And now he's working at Raven. And so, Jeff, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk to us a little bit about Raven Indigenous Capital Partner and what led to its creation.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. And I'm conscious of the time, so I'm gonna, although there's a presentation in front of everybody, I'm gonna, be somewhat speedy and then invite everyone to contact me afterwards should they so choose. Ani Boju, first of all, I just want to pay my respects. Today I'm sitting on Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish traditional territories, and that's gorgeous outside, so just let everyone know that. So just a little bit about why Raven. Really, the origin story is the three founding partners as an Indigenous social finance intermediary saw a couple of critical gaps in the market at a critical point in the history of Canada, where we had significant public reports and significant from inquiries to Truth and Reconciliation Commission to federal government that refocused its relationship to a number of things. But we also saw a critical inflection point in Indigenous, in the Indigenous economy and Indigenous businesses, where we see a pivot from what we would call a surviving to thriving mode. And we were approached, myself and others, from a lot of entrepreneurs and businesses looking for the missing middle in capital. That is capital that's between, it's in an equity space, sort of in the $250,000 to sort of $1.2 million range. And what we decided to do is, hey, let's create an impact fund that's really focused on investing and bringing bespoke technical assistance to Indigenous social enterprises. And the way we approach this, and I know I'm doing this fast, apologies to all, is, we have a phrase here at Raven where basically we are profit seeking but not profit maximizing. And I think when you talk about reconciliation, it's an important distinction. We're happy to get rates of return for our investors that are, they're not double digits, traditional Silicon Valley VC, but they're certainly respectable rates of return in the 6 to 8% range on the fund that allows us to have a sustainable approach to investing in these businesses. And we created this is a pilot fund. We've had our first close and are doing deals right now. And what I'm very happy to report is that the deal flow has vastly exceeded our capital. So take that as an invitation to all those with capital on the phone. And we are overwhelmed with joy about what we see in the Indigenous space from the social enterprise. Now, how we approach economic reconciliation is we want to invest in businesses and build economies where Indigenous people are at, to meet them where they are at and not have them fit into our categories, and approach that McConnell and Coast Funds and others also take. We consider what's really important here is responsible exits. We value leaving wealth, and there's different concepts in the Indigenous space about what wealth means. And very traditionally, wealth was designed to be given away and not maintained or hoarded. So the entrepreneurs that we work with actually look for ways to leave wealth with their families or inside the communities and to give it away. But we as an investor also look for ways to responsibly exit and leave the different types of capital back with the social enterprises. That's the financial capital, but it's also human capital and management experience, and try to embed that, build it, and leave it there with communities. And so part of what's happened in that is what we now are starting to see is the emergence of an Indigenous business-to-business marketplace which is very, very exciting. I'm going to do a very brief version of the funds or the products that we offer and why we built them. And the first was the Indigenous Social Enterprise Venture Capital Fund. You can see on your screen what it is. We were sector agnostic and seeking deal flow, but it has, naturally emerged into those areas that you see in front of you. Digital media, software service, ecological, ecotourism, environment, renewable energy, and a really exciting area of natural products sourced from the land and sea. So we also have a couple of other products, and some of it I don't think is covered on this slide deck. The other thing we're doing, which we think is really important to reconciliation, is we are building social finance instruments, and in this case, a community-driven outcomes contract where we're doing renewable energy in southern Manitoba, offering a 2-year fixed 4% rate of return that allows an Indigenous social enterprise to build 125 geothermal units on reserve. Now, what's really important about this is that we flip the relationship inside what would normally be considered something like a social impact bond. And what we've done here is put the community's priorities at the heart of it. And here's what we mean by acceleration. We take what the community wants to achieve, and we then build a financial instrument to make what they want to achieve. This has worked incredibly well, and we're just finishing off the investment round in the next few months. And they've already started to do the work on it. What this has led to is excitement from Indigenous communities for bigger, scalable instruments, both from the investor side and from Indigenous community side. And so we are working on a diabetes prevention management. We were asked to build a diabetes prevention and management, what we call solutions lab. And the capital raise, actually on the slide, it's a little under. The capital raise looks like about 15 to 20 million. And we may look at market-based instruments to actually do that in this case. And that's across 6 First Nations, some in the East and some of the West Coast. And, finally, what we offer, and I think this is important for some on the phone, is we believe very much so that you need to invest in Indigenous intermediaries and Indigenous entities to build a reconciliation economy. So we are, as a partner in the ESDC, as an expert service provider in their investment readiness phase. In the fall, we are starting an Indigenous accelerator for a little bit later stage Indigenous entrepreneurs for a 12-month intensive program to get them basically to market readiness and then align them with investment. And what we do in that is we'll look for $250,000 in sponsorship support, but that's actually the fee for an individual student at about $20,000 each to actually attend. And the last thing, and I don't know if it's on here or not, is that we've been asked to provide a bunch of advisory work to other funds out of both Canada and the United States on working in and how to work in and with Indigenous communities, and on a sort of basic fee for service and sort of tiered basis where we can talk about there are ways to engage and not engage and whom to engage and then how to structure that. Now, this is a very quick version with 2 minutes left in the webinar. I'm going to stop there, Andrea.
Thanks, Jeff. And again, I'm so sorry that we're a little bit squished today in terms of time, and I can tell that this is a very broad topic. And you can hear from our webinar participants, and I can just say that really there's sort of 3 things. If we go to the call to action step, 3 ways that we've heard about how you can really engage with this. One is that you can actually incorporate it into your policies and procedures, reconciliation into the fabric of your organization, as has been done at McConnell. You can invest in Indigenous-led funds or partner with support entities providing capacity development, such as Raven and many others like them that are sort of popping up. And then there's supporting reconciliation versus shareholder engagement and proxy voting, as we heard from Coast Mountain and from Sharon. I think we have 1 minute. I'm going to hand it over to Sharon to just sort of wrap us up.
Thank you. So maybe we can try just to stay a few minutes for some questions. One of the questions that I see that has come through, and perhaps I can ask this to Erica first, and if we can do sort of very quick responses in terms of what are some sort of 2 steps that you think foundations on the call can take to really start the process. So looking back at McConnell's experience, Erica, you know, what do you think were some of the key conversations that were had or key things that you did as a foundation to really get the momentum that we could see just in the sheer volume of activity that you have underway?
Yeah, just quickly. On the financial side, I think that really there's an opportunity to take any different type of step that your governance and your policies allow you to, from grants to concessionary investments to shareholder, et cetera. So looking at your policies, looking at your tools, and there's definitely opportunities to engage in different capacities. There's areas of the ecosystem that are more sort of like have a stronger economic and market track record than others, so you can really engage in a wide range of areas. But the more important piece that I would say that is essential to get started in this space, and Jeff was talking about that, and it was alluded throughout, are the relationships. This is an ecosystem and a space where the how you operate and how you engage is more important than the tools that you bring and the what you're focusing on. So really establishing those Indigenous partnerships that are going to give you the right insight into where the best opportunities are and where the most value add is that you can bring is key.
Great, thank you, Erica. Perhaps I know it's 11:01, so there are a few questions here that we aren't able to get to, but I will follow up by email. Yes, we will be providing a recorded version of this webinar, and we'll be sharing the slide deck with all that were registered. I really want to thank all of our speakers, Erica, Brodie, Jeff. I know you're all incredibly busy, and it's very generous for you to take the time and very quickly go through what is quite remarkable work and efforts and initiatives. And so hopefully that will lead to some people reaching out and looking more closely at what each of you are doing. We do have some more events coming up, and so a webinar in the fall on October 7th, looking at just transition and looking at the potential impact of the transition to a low carbon economy on workers, communities, etc. And so we're quite excited about that. I hope everybody who's here will be joining us there. As I said, I will be following up with an email in the next couple of days just with the recording. We'll ask you to fill out a short survey to give feedback on today, and also likely follow up with some links and a couple of additional resources there that can really build on the conversation that I think we got started today. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to the supporters of the Foundation Investing 2.0. And Andrea and I will say goodbye for now, and please be in touch directly with any questions or comments that you have.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Shannon.